Today we're going to start Unit 12 of Bio 102, and it's on conservation and biodiversity. So, measuring and defining biodiversity is going to be a very complex set of structures that we're going to go through. Biodiversity is going to be very important in benefiting humans in many ways. For example, there's going to be a chemical that's found in the bark of the Pacific yew tree called Taxol. Now, Taxol is going to be an effective treatment for different types of cancer, such as ovarian cancer, breast cancer, and lung cancer. And it's going to be able to do this because it interferes with mitosis of cells. So if these cells can't go through mitosis, they can't divide, and therefore they can't create the tumor. Consider also the following. We have vinblastin or vincristine. These are going to be from the Madagascar periwinkle. These are effective in treating leukemia and Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is going to be a once incurable disease. We have ancrode. This is going to be found in the myelinian pit viper. This helps dissolve blood clots, so it helps as an anticoagulant. It's also effective in treating some heart attack and stroke patients. Then you have epibactidine. This is a poisonous compound that's going to be found in the saliva of small frogs. It's going to be found in the Ecuadorian region. It's going to be 200 times more effective than morphine in relieving pain. So it's going to be more than just a utilitarian resource. Biodiversity is going to have a naturalistic, symbolic, and an aesthetic importance as well. Biodiversity isn't going to be easily defined. So what is biodiversity in a particular patch of land, for example? Well, technically it's going to, what we do define it as a variety and variability among all genes, alleles, species, and ecosystems on Earth. So here, looking at genes and alleles, it could be the number of alleles in a species. If you look at species, it's going to be the number of species in an ecosystem. And if you look at the ecosystem, it's the number of ecosystems in a region. Conservation biology is going to be the interdisciplinary field that addresses how to understand and preserve the Earth's natural resources, and its main goal is preservation and protection of biodiversity. So where is most biodiversity? Looking here, we see with biodiversity, you have different areas. As you move away from the equator, you're going to have less biodiversity, but the closer you are to the equator, looking at these different areas, you'll see how the biodiversity increases. So we know here that most animals and plants in different ecosystems will thrive in warmer, wetter conditions. So basically, diversity of organisms and plants and animals are going to be found in the tropics, more so than compared to the poles here. And so it's also going to occur by looking at this on both land and in the ocean. So why are there more species in an acre of tropical rainforest than in an acre further from the equator, such as the temperate forest or the prairie? That's called latitudinal biodiversity. And so there's three main factors that are going to influence this species richness. You have your solar energy that's going to be available, so there's greater access to solar energy and fuel for life in these areas. You have an evolutionary history of that area, so the communities of diversity over time. So the more time that passes without climatic events, the greater diversity in that area. So these areas tend to be the same throughout. They don't change in temperature often, and they always have the same amount of moisture coming in. And then the rate of disturbance. So the habitats within the intermediate amount of disturbance has the greater species richness. So we're not going to see a lot of disturbance in this area. So here are the visuals. So you've got the solar energy coming in, evolutionary history, and rate of disturbance. Sometimes we have what's referred to as biodiversity hotspots, and these basically are going to be regions of the world that are having significant reservoirs of biodiversity under threat of destruction. So 25 hotspots have been identified around the world. Some main ones that we see here, we have our coral reefs of the Philippines, we have tropical rainforests like this one here in Costa Rica, and our islands like Madagascar. Now with these hotspots, they actually cover less than 1% of the Earth, but they contain about 20% or more of the world's species. Now looking at the islands here, the island biogeography is there's a theory that generates that we have predictions about the pattern of species diversity in isolated habitats. And so the isolated habitats that we're going to look at are going to be like islands, lakes, and mountaintops. It's going to help make sense of the maintenance and loss of biodiversity here. Two fundamental components are going to be used when looking at islands as an examples. You have the area that it affects. For example, there's going to be a close relationship between the number of species that inhabit an island and the island's area, and larger an island, the more species that it's going to be able to hold. You also have what's called the distance effect. There is going to be a close relationship between the number of species inhabiting an island and how isolated that the island is. So the farther an island is from mainland, the fewer species that you'll find there, and the fewer species it will hold. Species balance on an island is going to be determined by the balance between the rate of immigration and the rate of extinction of the species. So the rate of immigration is the island going to be closer to the mainland? If so, it's going to have a higher rate of immigration. Mainland's going to serve as like a pool of new species that can come into this area. It's going to decrease the number of species on an island if it's going to be further away. Rate of extinction. So smaller islands are going to have higher rates of extinction than larger islands, and that's going to result because it has that smaller population size. So it's going to increase as the number of species on islands increases. And then you have what's referred to as a dynamic equilibrium. That's going to be a composition of species on an island that would not be fixed. So species composition would change over time. So although an isolation or isolated habitat may be full with, let's say, 10 species of birds, exactly which 10 species occur could change over time. It might not be the same species. Ideas gained have important implications for the development of nature preserves. So developing nature preserves are going to be as close as possible as we can to a source of new species. So island biogeography, like we said, helps us understand the maintenance and loss of biodiversity. So here we're going to have an example. E.O. Wilson and Daniel Simberloff exterminated all the insects on multiple islands. Then they monitored recolonization to test the theory of island biology that we just talked about. So remember, with this, the theory of island biogeography is that it's designed to explain and predict patterns of species diversity on islands, and it's going to have those two fundamental components, the area effect and the distance effect. So remember, with that area effect, there's going to be a close relationship between the number of species inhabiting an island and the island's area. The larger the island is, the more species it holds. And then the distance effect is that there's a close relationship between the number of species inhabiting an island and how isolated that island is, or how far away it is from a mainland. So if it's far away or if it's more isolated, it's going to have fewer species. So here, looking at that equilibrium, that remembers the number of species on an island represents a balance between the rate of immigration to that island by new species and the rate of extinction of species already on the island. And so there you find in the center the equilibrium. So with dynamic equilibrium, that's where the composition of species on that island isn't fixed, so it can change over time. So the island might have, let's say, 5 species of birds here, but exactly which 5 species that occur on the island can change over time. So, looking at that experiment, they're looking for island recolonization. So the closer the islands were colonized more quickly than distant islands. So the ones that were closer to each other or closer to the mainland received more species back a lot quicker. On all of the islands, the number of insect species after fumigation returned to about the same number of insect species prior to fumigation. So we see that they all did come back. And the composition of insects on each island changed over the course of the study, even on the 2 control islands. So that shows, even since it changed on the control islands, that those species didn't remain the same over long periods of time. Extinction is going to reduce biodiversity. Basically, extinction is going to be the complete loss of an individual in a specific species. So that species will be completely wiped out. Here we see an example, once numbering in the millions, the passenger pigeons were going to be hunted to extinction. The last passenger pigeon on Earth, named Martha, died at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. Now we've got 2 categories of extinction. You have what's known as mass extinction. That's going to be a large number of species, for example, entire families, become extinct over short periods of time. Usually this occurs as a result of an extraordinary and sudden environmental change. Background extinctions are extinctions that are occurring at lower rates during times other than mass extinctions. There's going to be 3 factors that influence extinction. We have the geographic range. That's going to be extensive versus restricted. So species that are restricted in their range are going to be more vulnerable than those that have an extensive range that they can travel. The example would be like the Tasmanian devil. When it's confined to the island of Tasmania, that confinement actually gave it a smaller area to live. It was about the size of Maine, so if something happened to that area, then that animal would be more likely to go extinct. Local population size, large versus small. So species with small population size are at an increased risk of extinction. A variety of factors could influence this: fire, disease, habitat destruction, predation, interbreeding. So interbreeding generally is going to reduce the fertility and longevity of individuals, like in tigers. Here you see frogs, and so they were reduced in habitat size. And then habitat tolerance, broad versus narrow. So species with narrow habitat tolerance are going to be at a greater risk of extinction than species with a broad habitat tolerance due to the habitat degradation and loss. So if they're able to resist those changes, then they're more likely going to be able to survive in that area after it's changed. So right now we're in the midst of a mass extinction. So current rates of extinction in very well-studied groups of plants and animals support the hypothesis that a mass extinction is currently underway. And it seems to be the result of activity of one species, humans. So basically, 70% of biologists believe that this is true. Data from well-studied groups of plants and animals is going to support this hypothesis. So looking here, we see deforestation in the tropics. It's going to be a leading cause of biodiversity loss. The bonobos are going to be the closest living relatives of humans, and they've been driven to close to extinction in part due to hunting. So basically, with these, the data is going to be well studied, like we said, in groups. Mammals, we have 11% of all species are going endangered, and about 14% is going to be threatened. With birds, the last check numbers were 4% of all species are endangered, with 50% in decline. With amphibians, we have a third of all amphibian species that are threatened at this point. With fish, mollusks, insects, fungi, and plants, we have the same story going on. Background extinction rates, we have like 1 extinction per million species per year, And so data is going to suggest that current extinction rates are about 1,000 times greater than usual. And it seems to be a result of human activity. We said here we have our deforestation. That's one of the chief reasons for impending loss of many species. It results in habitat loss. It's going to be harmful with that habitat loss, especially in the tropics, because biodiversity is going to be the greatest here. Half of the tropical rainforest have been destroyed already. And unfortunately, when they destroy these and we lose this biodiversity, that's where a lot of our medicines and things are going to be made. The reason they're destroying this is over exploitation of the crops, agriculture, logging, urban development. They're using up the food resources in this area, and they're killing the animals for things like furs. So human interference generally is going to reduce biodiversity. So some eco-disturbances are going to be reversible, but others are not. So we're going to have two types, reversible versus irreversible. So once land is cultivated or developed, can it ever return to its natural state? Well, it can go through a certain ecological succession. So looking here, we have May 1980. Everything was fine and dandy. Then, by September of 1980, the top blew off. And so this is Mount St. Helens. Today, you can look at it. You can see how some of the plants and animals around that area seem to be coming back, but it does take a long period of time for this to occur. So reversible would be a disturbance of biotic and abiotic nature of habitat. For example, with Mount St. Helens, that was an abiotic disturbance. It does not involve complete extinction of any species and allows the species to be reestablished in their populations. Here we have the blue whale. It's going to be the largest mammal in the world and the largest animal ever known to have lived on Earth. Once it's lost, the species can never be recreated. So this would be an irreversible loss. So that disturbance involves the complete loss of the species, so it completely goes extinct. So disruptions of ecosystems can be disastrous. One way, we have introduction of exotic species. So an exotic species is going to refer to a species introduced by human activity to areas other than species that are going to be native to that area. So it can be intentional or it can be unintentional. These species can cause harm. It can cause economic, environmental, or harm to human health even. Two characteristics that make these invasive species dangerous is that they have no predators, basically, and so they're able to grow unchecked. So here we see a moat parakeet. These were imported from South America as pets because they're cute. Lots of people liked them, nice bright colors, but unfortunately some escaped, and now they're a nuisance to cities. See, here we see in Chicago that they've built large nests on electric poles and transformers and floodlights, and it could actually cause damage to our infrastructure. So why would we worry about exotic species? Like, for example, the brown tree snake. Well, it could cause disastrous disruptions to areas that they go to. So they can threaten the native populations, for example. It could cause, once it's introduced, it could cause problems with the animals that are there. It could cause sickness or illness. They could grow unchecked. Or it can mess up the habitat in that area and even cause plants to go extinct. So here's some examples of some accidental exotic species that were introduced. The brown tree snakes were introduced to the island of Guam. They have eradicated most of the native species of birds, which had never experienced predation by snakes and hadn't developed a defense mechanism. We've got the purple loosestrife. The purple loosestrife is going to be introduced to the United States as a garden plant. It escaped from cultivation and has invaded wetlands in every state except Florida. This is an aggressive plant. It outgrows the native grasses, sedges, and flowering plants, so it basically outcompetes them, and they can't grow. The zebra mussels are going to be introduced to the Great Lakes. They can cause damage to industrial facilities by clogging intake pipes. They also deplete resources that were available for smaller fish and eliminates a food supply for large game fish. Here, initially introduced to Australia to control agricultural pests, we have the cane toad. Well, its population exploded, and now it has more than 200 million, and they become a nuisance to most of the country. Also, with the cane toad, it actually killed a lot of the indigenous snakes, lizards, birds, and even crocodiles because they're poisonous to them. Strategies for solution: we can have better regulation and restriction of intentional introductions, and better vigilance against accidental introductions. So, next one, acid rain and the burning of fossil fuels. So rain is usually just pure water. So how can it turn to acid exactly? Well, it forms acid precipitation in a 3-step process. It could be from burning fossil fuels. It could be from combining with water vapor in the atmosphere, and then it falls to the earth. So here we have the burning fossil fuels that release sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. Any of those fossil fuels that do this can be things such as oil, natural gas, or coal. It combines with that water vapor in the atmosphere, compounds from sulfuric acid and nitric acid, and then the acid's going to fall to the earth as acid precipitation. This can not just be rain as you know it, but it can also be things like fog, sleet, and even snow. So it can cause direct and indirect problems here. Some of the direct effects, it could kill plants and aquatic animals. Indirect effects, it can disrupt soil and water chemistry. Some of the strategies for a solution here, you can have tighter regulations and reduction of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide emissions, and improving energy efficiency through the use of wind or solar energy. Here you see acid rain distribution throughout the United States. Notice how the East Coast has a higher acidity. And by higher acidity, remember, acid is going to be 6 or lower. So 6 is going to be the least acidic. As you go lower, it becomes more acidic. So in this case, 4 is more acidic than 5. So the effects of acidic rain, you have direct result from contact with living tissue and acidic water, so it can be corrosive. It could actually eat away at the tissue. It could cause different types of dermatitis and problems, depending on what type of organism it's hitting. Indirect effects are going to be produced by interactions between non-living and living systems. See here you see direct effects of acid hitting the tissue of the tree. These trees that were exposed to the acid rain or acid fog now have damaged leaves and decreased rates of photosynthesis, and it starts to eat away at the bark, and eventually a lot of these trees will die out. Next we have our global warming and greenhouse effects. Now, the greenhouse effect is going to basically describe the process by which energy from the sun warms the Earth's atmosphere. It's going to occur in 3 steps. With this, we have energy from the sun we see coming in. It's going to pass through the atmosphere and warm the Earth's surface. Some of that energy is going to be reflected back towards space and escape the atmosphere. And then some of the energy is going to be absorbed by greenhouse gases and remain trapped in the atmosphere, which is going to heat the air. The most important greenhouse gases that we have on Earth are going to be carbon dioxide and methane. So why do we blame global warming on humans? Well, humans have increased the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We do this by burning things such as fossil fuels for energy that we use, and they release carbon dioxide. Right now, you hear a lot of this going on in a lot of politics and talks. It's called your carbon emissions. So the problem is the average temperature is going to increase rapidly during the past 50 years with these greenhouse gases and this carbon footprint, and it's going to affect both physical environments and biological worlds. So the cause, burning fossil fuels, like we said, is going to emit a lot of these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So strategies for this is that we could reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, particularly from burning these fossil fuels, so with creating electricity, heating our house, and getting from place to place. Looking here, we can see the ice cap melting. Arctic Ocean ice caps in Antarctica and Greenland glaciers are melting at a very rapid rate. They will result in an increase in ocean levels, which will eventually create flooding. Trees and flowers in northern latitudes are starting to bloom a lot earlier. We have migratory birds and animals such that arriving at the summer ranges earlier and earlier. And birds and butterflies are going to extend their geographic ranges northward because of this heat up. With this, we have our average annual temperature, which is predicted to rise about 2 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit during the 21st century. So this is also going to affect sea levels as glaciers and ice sheets continue to melt. It's predicted to cause the rise of the ocean levels or sea levels anywhere from 7 to 24 inches. Rainfall is predicted to decrease, and we're going to see droughts, they think, becoming more frequent and severe. And so some strategies and solutions, like we said, reduce the emission of greenhouse gases from burning of fossil fuels, reduce deforestation while increasing the replanting of these forests, and reduce dependence on fossil fuels. Next, we have depletion of our ozone layer. Now, the ozone layer is going to be found in the upper part of the stratosphere. It's about 30 miles above the Earth's surface. It's going to help provide protection from UV radiation. This UV radiation, when it comes through, can cause sunburn, which eventually leads to skin cancer, and we've noticed a high rise in skin cancer lately. Lots of things that can deplete the ozone. One of the main ones is CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons. These are synthetic chemicals that have been considered the main cause of this depletion, like I said. They basically get leaked into the atmosphere, and once they rise to that stratosphere, it then starts to break down the ozone, and from there it's going to be able to allow these UV rays to come in and cause problems. Some of the things that we find this in are going to be refrigeration systems, coolants, hairsprays, styrofoams. These products with CFCs have been phased out by most countries, and so we have started to see the depletion of these, and hopefully the ozone layer will start to rebuild itself. And so September 1979, you can see, and then by 1998, you see how much larger it's gotten by the year 2000, and then 2006. So one interesting fact is they said that they actually saw the ozone hole start to reduce in size during COVID, when people were not driving from place to place or using as many fossil fuels. Should you be concerned about the ozone hole in our atmosphere? Well, in general, we should be concerned about that because allowing all of that to come through could increase our chances of skin cancer, as well as it protecting the earth. It is causing the temperatures on Earth to rise. So some products that you can check on to make sure that you don't use these CFCs and emit them into the atmosphere are things such as hairspray. They contain a lot of CFCs, or styrofoam boxes. We have seen a reduction in styrofoam, and a lot of places have gone to more paper type products that can break down So let's go back to talking about the ozone for a moment. With the ozone, we do have two ozone layer depletion types. We have the general reduction, like we can see here in the 1970s. The amount of ozone in the stratosphere was decreasing by about 4% a decade. Then we had the formation of areas with very low ozone concentration called ozone holes. These were found over the north and south poles every winter. They form when cold temperatures and circulation flow in air over the poles during winter have a concentration of those CFCs, and they create what's known as Arctic ozone holes. They last for several months actually, and they can cover an entire continent and extend to the south tips of South America and Australia even. The Arctic ozone hole is going to be smaller than the Antarctic ozone hole. It doesn't last as long, and it extends southward into northern Europe, Asia, and North America. So with the main effect here, it's going to allow those short wavelength ultraviolet lights, the UVB lights, to reach the surface. That can increase 1% in UV intensity, increases our chance of skin cancer by 2 to 3%. It promotes the formation of cataracts in our eyes, so it can actually be damaging to our eyes when we're outside, and it can reduce the effectiveness of our immune system, as well as reducing the rate of photosynthesis in plants. And if it does that, it's going to reduce crop yields and cause them to decline. So we have what we can do called ozone level stabilization and recovery. So basically, as a result of discontinued use of these CFCs, we have seen a recovery and stabilization in our ozone, and hopefully it will continue to grow back together, and those holes will hopefully eventually close. Next, we have deforestation of tropic rainforests. So with these, we have our tropical rainforests, which grow in regions that extend north and south of the equator, crossing South America, Africa, Asia, and Australia. A few centuries ago, they actually covered about 6 million square miles, and they became the most diverse terrestrial habitat on Earth. But for more than half of this has been destroyed just within the past 200 years. Nearly 12 square miles are cleared per day. And 3 reasons for this destruction right now. We have agricultural destruction. People are planting and trying to create different places so they can grow products. They have a slash and burn agriculture where they can actually come in, and it involves relatively small areas, but they cut the trees down, they burn them, and then they plant the crops that they're looking for in those areas. All right. They use that land after they do this, but it's only going to be fertile for about 2 or 3 years because they don't come in and rotate these crops. That land's then going to be abandoned, and then they go to the next area where they'll slash, cut, and burn again, and do this for another 2 to 3 years. We have what's known as multinational corporation agriculture, where they'll come in and they will clear hundreds of thousands of acres in order to create large crops or livestock. We have oil wells and gold mines that are going on in these, and this is going to result in pollution of those areas. The oil wells can leak into the streams and groundwater and creates acidic water that's going to drain from the mines, and it enters these streams as well. We have road building going through these areas as they become more populated. That's also going to be necessary to move these agricultural products and these mining products that they're getting. And so that's going to create problems with runoff. And because of all these things, we're going to have 2 serious environmental impacts. It's going to reduce biodiversity in the rainforest. Remember, they're going to be the ones that are most biodiverse, that has the most number of species of animals and plants in this area. It actually has over half the world's biodiverse hotspots, and they're being destroyed. Also, Since we're destroying these, it is increasing greenhouse gases. So photosynthesis actually removes about 6 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere per year. So that's a huge carbon footprint that it can take in and remove. If you remove the plants, then you're going to remove the ability to take out this carbon. And so it's going to increase the carbon footprint that someone would have. And so, looking here, you can see the different tropical rainforests in the area. Before human influence was in yellow, and then after or current is in green. So the yellow is gone. Okay. And so this is what we talked about, the different areas. So planting new trees can undo some of the damage. So if you do go in and cut the trees, then you need to replace those plant products. So we can develop strategies for effective conservation. So with limited conservation resources, we must prioritize which species should be preserved. So, what should we protect? Which is going to be more important to protect, a beautiful species such as a snow leopard or soil bacteria with unknown roles in their ecosystem? Well, it's hard to tell which one. The soil bacteria might actually help the plants, remember, be able to take in nitrogen. If you have more plants growing, then you're going to be able to provide more of a food source for all animals, as well as reduce the carbon footprint. So in setting conservation policies or conservation efforts, it's a two-step process. You can articulate the goals and develop a plan. So you can go in after conservation efforts on individual species, or you can go after an important habitat or area. There's going to be multiple effective strategies for preserving the biodiversity of an area. We have what's known as the worldwide funds, the Global 200, that can go in. They use an identification of all the most biological distinct habitats on Earth. So they look at terrestrial, freshwater, and marine habitats. We have landscape conservation, which is going to be geared towards conserving not just species, but habitats and ecological processes. Here we have one of the first national parks. Yosemite was one of the first efforts at preserving wilderness. So when you design this, you can go in and design natural preserves, and this actually has evolved over time. So we have the modern preserve focus on the use of several design features that maximize the efficiency. So we have what's called corridors. These are setting aside narrow strips of land that connect larger natural preserves and allows the gene flow and reduces inbreeding among distinct populations in different larger areas. Then you have what's referred to as buffer zones. These are going to preserve design with the core areas containing the habitat to be conserved, surrounded by a buffer zone in which it has limited amounts of human use and is going to be permitted. It can sustain wildlife even as increasing human populations exist adjacent to those preserves. So when you look at these, you have what's referred to as flagship species. These are going to include species that are going to be charismatic, distinctive, vulnerable, and appealing. Generally, they're going to stimulate significant public support, and the preservation can serve to preserve other species as well, like the giant panda, the golden lion, tamarin, the mountain gorilla, the orangutan, the leatherback sea turtle, Indian tiger, and African elephant. You also have what's known as a keystone species. These species are going to be those that are usually a large influence on the presence or absence of numerous other species in that community. So if you remove them, it can lead to massive changes in composition of species in an ecosystem and could cause a huge loss of biodiversity. So example, we have the California mussels, grizzly bears, beavers, and sea stars. Next we have indicator species. Indicator species are those who have a presence within an ecosystem that indicates the presence of a large range of other species. Example, a lichen. The absence or presence of an indicator species can tell you about its air quality. So with this one, It has a sensitivity to sulfur dioxide, so if there's sulfur dioxide present, then you will not find lichens around. Then you have what's known as an umbrella species. That's a wide range of species with large needs for habitat and other resources. As a preservation protects numbers of other species within the same habitat and can include large, wide-ranging vertebrates. So captive breeding and habitat restoration. This can be helpful in bringing back biodiversity from the brink of extinction. So we can have, for example, zoos and botanical gardens, which can help with this. It can locate and bring in these captive or these species and use a captive breeding system. In this case, it can bring species with decreasing populations into an area and help bring those numbers up by breeding them in a safe space and then releasing them. For example, they did this in California with the California condor. The population dropped to 22 individuals as a result of poaching and lead poisoning, and also because of habitat loss in the 1980s. So individuals were able to capture these, what were left, take them to zoos, and begin what's known as a captive breeding program. By 2009, more than 100 birds were released into the wild, and then more than 150 remained in the zoo, and they continued to breed these to bring the numbers up. That's going to end us for Biology 102, our Unit 12, and I hope that you had a wonderful semester in this class.